On the morning of August 13, 2018, a medical examiner stood over a body recovered from a shallow grave at a remote oil field in Weld County, Colorado. The woman in that grave had come home from a work trip less than 12 hours earlier. She was 34 years old. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, the clothing of someone who had gone to bed. And on her body, the examiner found something that would become the most haunting detail in an already devastating case. He found nothing. No broken fingernails. No bruising on her forearms. No skin beneath her nails. No sign that her body had ever been given the chance to fight back. And that absence, that silence written into her skin, is the most precise thing the science ever recorded about the final moments of Shanann Watts' life. If you are new here, welcome to Crimes Records, the channel where every case is handled with the accuracy it deserves and the care the victims have always been owed. Hit that subscribe button now, because what we are about to walk through is not speculation, not dramatization. It is the documented forensic record of one of the most closely examined homicide cases in recent American history, and every word of it is real. But before we open that report, before we follow the medical examiner's findings phase by phase through the clinical map of what happened in that bedroom, we need to understand who Shanann Watts was before she became a case number. Because the autopsy report will tell you what her body recorded. The life she lived before that morning will tell you why it matters. Shanann was born on January 10, 1984, in Aberdeen, North Carolina. She grew up in a close family. The kind of person who, by every account from those who knew her, occupied more space in a room than her physical size suggested. She was energetic, emotionally open, and deeply invested in the people around her. She was the kind of woman who remembered what you told her 3 weeks ago and asked about it. The kind of woman who made you feel like the conversation you were having with her was the only one she wanted to be having. That quality, that genuine and relentless warmth, would later be visible in every Facebook Live video she ever recorded, and those videos would become some of the most haunting documents of her final weeks on Earth, because they capture her alive and ordinary and completely unaware of what was coming. In her mid-20s, Shanann's life was disrupted by something she could not control. She began losing significant amounts of weight in a short period of time. Her hair was thinning. Her body ached in ways that limited her daily functioning. She was exhausted in a way that sleep did not fix. She went to doctors and received diagnoses that were wrong, medications that helped nothing, and years of uncertainty about what her own body was doing to her. In May of 2010, after those years of misdiagnosis, she was finally given the correct answer: systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune disease in which the immune system attacks the body's own healthy tissue. She was also subsequently diagnosed with fibromyalgia, a second autoimmune condition that compounded the physical burden she was already carrying. She later described that period in one of her Facebook Live broadcasts, talking about going from a size 6 to a size 0 in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks, about not being able to get out of bed for days, about finally dragging herself to a doctor's office and demanding answers. She talked about Googling lupus for the first time and how the internet told her she was going to die, and she laughed while saying it. The specific laugh of someone who has been on the other side of a terrifying thing and made it through. That matters, because Shanann Watts was not someone who quit when things became hard. She was someone who had spent years fighting a body that worked against her and had found a way to keep showing up. That history of resilience is not a footnote in this story. It is the foundation of who she was when everything else began to fall apart. In 2010, the same year she received her lupus diagnosis, Shanann met Christopher Lee Watts in North Carolina. Chris was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina, and by every external account he was unremarkable in the most precise sense of that word. He was quiet. He was calm. He was described by neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances as mild-mannered, even-keeled, and easy to overlook. He had no criminal history. He caused no trouble. He was the kind of person who could stand in a room full of people and leave no impression. To Shanann, in those early years, that steadiness may have felt like safety. On November 3, 2012, they married in North Carolina. Not long after, they relocated to Frederick, Colorado, where Chris had secured employment as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, an oil and gas company with field operations across Weld County. The move placed Shanann far from the family and support network she had built in North Carolina, and it placed her, in practical terms, in a life where Chris was her primary anchor. The family grew. Their first daughter, Bella Marie Watts, was born on December 17, 2013. Their second daughter, Celeste Catherine Watts, known to everyone as CC, was born on July 17, 2015. And in the same year Celeste was born, the financial architecture beneath this family began to show its first serious cracks. The Watts family filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in North Carolina, listing debts exceeding $700,000. The bankruptcy was discharged, and they continued forward in Colorado, but the financial pressure did not disappear. It relocated with them. From the outside, from the curated surface of Shanann's social media presence, none of that was visible. She had become a promoter and distributor for Level Thrive, a health and wellness multi-level marketing company whose products she credited with helping her manage the fatigue and physical limitations of her lupus. She was genuinely enthusiastic about the brand, and she channeled that enthusiasm into a prolific social media presence. She conducted Facebook Live broadcasts regularly, talking to her audience with the same warmth and openness that defined every relationship in her life. She shared her story. She shared her morning routines, her team, her children, her journey with lupus, her gratitude. Those broadcasts accumulated thousands of followers and painted a picture of a woman who had built something meaningful from her own struggle. But by the summer of 2018, the private picture looked nothing like the public one. The mortgage on their home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick was approximately $70,000 in delinquency. A notice from the Homeowners Association had been received regarding late payments. Shanann's Thrive income was not sufficient to cover the gap, and the combined financial weight of a large home, 2 children, and the cost of living in suburban Colorado had accumulated into a burden that was straining everything beneath the surface of their family life. And then, in late June of 2018, something happened that Shanann did not yet know about. Chris Watts began an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a data analyst who also worked in the oil and gas industry. The affair began in June and intensified rapidly through July and into August. In the weeks that followed the affair's beginning, people in Shanann's life began to notice something different about Chris. He was more distant. He was secretive with his phone. He was emotionally unavailable in a way that Shanann began to describe in private messages to her closest friend, Cassandra Rosenberg, with increasing urgency. She told Cassie that something was wrong. She did not know what it was. She could not name it, but she felt it. In late July and early August of 2018, Shanann took the girls to visit her family in North Carolina. During those weeks, Chris remained in Colorado. He barely called. He barely texted. The communication between them became sparse and strained, and Shanann's messages to Cassie during that period reflect a woman who was trying to hold on to a marriage she could feel slipping away while simultaneously carrying a pregnancy she was deeply happy about. Because in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the financial delinquency and the emotional withdrawal and the mounting private anxiety about her marriage, Shanann was pregnant. She and Chris were expecting a boy. She had chosen his name, Nico Lee Watts. She had announced the pregnancy publicly with open and unguarded joy. She had talked about him on video. She had shared the news with her community. She was 15 weeks along by the time she boarded a flight back to Colorado in August. From August 10th to August 12th, 2018, Shanann traveled to Scottsdale, Arizona, for a Level Thrive business conference. She went with Nicole Atkinson, a friend and fellow promoter. During those days in Arizona, Shanann exchanged text messages with Chris that were later reviewed by investigators. They were tense. His responses were short and emotionally flat. Shanann was pressing him on the state of their marriage, and what she was receiving back was the communicative equivalent of a closed door. She told Cassie from Arizona that she was terrified of what she would come home to, but she was also hopeful. She was thinking about the baby. She was thinking about the girls. She was thinking about finding a way through. On the evening of August 12th, their flight home was delayed. It landed later than scheduled, and by the time Shanann arrived at her front door at 2825 Saratoga Trail, it was 1:48 in the morning. Nicole Atkinson dropped her off. Shanann entered the house. Her daughters were asleep in their rooms. Her husband was in the bedroom. She set down her luggage. Her wedding ring, which she had removed before the Arizona trip, was already on the nightstand where she had left it. She got into bed next to Chris Watts. She was exhausted. She was pregnant. She was home. She trusted the person lying next to her because she had no reason not to. That is the last moment anyone outside of that bedroom can place Shanann Watts alive. And the next person to encounter her was a medical examiner in Weld County, Colorado, several days later, standing over a shallow grave at the Survey 319 oil and gas well site, approximately 40 miles from the home where she had gone to sleep. The autopsy of Shanann Watts, officially designated as case number 1835 by the Weld County Coroner's Office, begins not in the morgue, but at the recovery site itself. The medical examiner's preliminary notes document the environmental conditions of the body as it was found. She had been in that shallow grave for several days in August heat, and the earth had begun to facilitate early decomposition. The first external observations were recorded at the scene before the body was transported. She was dressed in a t-shirt and underwear. No shoes, no jacket, no additional clothing. The clothing of a person who had gone to bed and never had the opportunity to do anything else. Her wedding ring was not on her person. It had already been documented at the residence, sitting on the nightstand where she had placed it before leaving for Arizona. That single detail, the absence of a ring, is the first absence in a report that will be defined by what is missing. And it is also the first piece of the clinical record that places her exactly where she was, home, asleep, in the moments before she was killed. As the formal examination commenced, the pregnancy was documented. The autopsy confirmed the presence of a male fetus at approximately 15 weeks of gestational age. And with that confirmation came one of the most distressing findings in the report: post-mortem fetal extrusion. This is a biological process in which decomposition gases accumulate within the abdominal cavity and, in pregnant women, physically expel the contents of the uterus after death. It is not an act of violence. It is a consequence of burial. It is the body, after death, in the earth. The medical significance of this finding is precise and devastating in equal measure. It confirms that the physiological connection between Shanann and her son remained intact until the moment she died. The extrusion occurred only after she was placed in that grave, after the earth was above her. But the finding that would carry the most weight in the legal proceedings to follow, and the finding that would reshape the public understanding of exactly what happened in that bedroom, was not about the pregnancy. It was about what was not on her hands. The medical examiner found no defensive wounds. There were no broken fingernails. There was no bruising on the hands or forearms that occurs when a person raises their arms to block an attack. There was no skin beneath her nails, no evidence that she had made contact with her attacker in any physical way. In forensic pathology, the absence of defensive wounds is not a neutral observation. It is a specific piece of information about the circumstances of an attack. It tells the examiner what the victim was not given the chance to do. Defensive wounds appear when a person has time to register what is happening and to respond to it physically. Their absence tells the examiner that no such window existed. Shanann Watts arrived home at 1:48 in the morning. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She had been on a delayed flight. She was exhausted. She got into bed. And the science confirms that she never had the chance to raise her hands. The second phase of the examination moved from the external surface of the body to the internal structures of the neck and throat, which in any death involving potential strangulation become the most critical area of the entire examination. The medical examiner conducted a layer-by-layer dissection of the neck musculature, working through each level of soft tissue to identify signs of trauma that are frequently invisible at the skin surface. In cases of manual strangulation, the internal structures of the neck typically reveal hemorrhaging within the soft tissue because the pressure required to occlude the airway and blood vessels causes small blood vessels to rupture deep within the muscle layers, leaving evidence that the skin above it may not show. One of the most frequently misunderstood findings in the report involves the hyoid bone. The hyoid is a small, U-shaped bone located at the base of the tongue, and in cases of violent strangulation, particularly those involving sudden upward force, this bone can fracture. In Shanann's case, the autopsy report explicitly states that the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage remained intact and showed no evidence of fractures. This finding is commonly misread by people unfamiliar with forensic pathology as evidence against strangulation, but the science is precise on this point. An intact hyoid bone is entirely consistent with manual strangulation, particularly in younger victims whose bones are more pliable, or in cases where the pressure applied was broad and sustained rather than sharp and sudden. Shanann was 34 years old. Her bones were not brittle, and what the internal examination revealed in the tissue surrounding that intact bone told a different story entirely. Deep inside the neck musculature, the examiner found hemorrhaging. The soft tissue showed congestion. These are the hallmarks of sustained pressure applied from the outside over a period of time long enough to rupture the small blood vessels embedded within the muscle. This is not the evidence of a brief and incidental contact. This is the evidence of a continuous act. The report also noted the absence of petechial hemorrhages, the small red or purple spots that appear in the whites of the eyes or on the eyelids when capillaries in those areas rupture from the back pressure of blood that cannot circulate. Petechiae are commonly associated with strangulation, and their absence in this case has a specific forensic interpretation. When pressure is applied to the neck so immediately and so completely that blood flow to the head is cut off almost instantly, the back pressure that causes petechiae to form never has the opportunity to build. The absence of those spots is not evidence against strangulation. It is evidence of the speed and totality with which the pressure was applied. A continuous, uninterrupted application of force so complete that her cardiovascular system never had the chance to produce the response typically seen in these cases. The medical examiner's report describes, in the precise and bloodless language of clinical science, a single sustained act that lasted until her heart stopped. She did not wake up. She did not have time to raise her hands. The science confirmed both of those things in the same examination. If you are finding this case important, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told accurately and completely, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Records. Every case on this channel is handled with the same commitment to forensic accuracy and the same respect for the people at the center of it. Now let's continue. The third phase of the examination turned to the thoracic and abdominal cavities and to the toxicology results, which provide some of the most objective data available in any post-mortem examination. In Shanann's case, the internal organ examination revealed a body that, prior to the assault, was structurally healthy. Her heart showed no signs of chronic disease. Her liver presented no pathology. There were no pre-existing conditions in any major organ system that could have contributed to or explained her death through any natural mechanism. The lungs told a different story. They were significantly congested and edematous, filled with fluid that had accumulated during the final moments of asphyxiation as the body fought to draw oxygen from an airway that had been sealed by external pressure. Pulmonary edema of this kind is a documented physiological response to asphyxiation, and its presence in Shanann's lungs is consistent with every other finding in the report. The toxicology results are among the most important and most misrepresented findings in this case, and they deserve careful explanation. Analysis of Shanann's blood showed a blood alcohol concentration of 0.128%. In a living person, that figure would represent significant intoxication. But Shanann's body had been in a shallow grave for several days in summer heat, and the medical examiner noted this immediately. In a decomposing body, bacteria produce ethanol as a natural byproduct of the decomposition process. This phenomenon, known as post-mortem ethanol production, can generate measurable blood alcohol concentrations entirely unrelated to any alcohol the person consumed while alive. To confirm whether any of that ethanol was the result of actual consumption, the examiner tested the vitreous humor, the fluid inside the eye, which is more biologically isolated and more resistant to post-mortem chemical changes than blood. The vitreous humor showed no alcohol whatsoever. The medical conclusion was absolute. Shanann Watts was completely sober at the time of her death. She had consumed no alcohol. No drugs were detected in her system. No medications. no Valium sedatives, no substances of any kind that could have altered her state of consciousness or awareness beyond the simple fact that she was asleep. She was not drugged. She was not impaired by anything she had taken. She was asleep in her own bed, in her own home, next to her husband, with a healthy pregnancy, with food still digesting in her stomach from a meal she had eaten a few hours earlier on her way home from Arizona. The stomach contents were examined and found to contain a small amount of partially digested material, including what appeared to be greens and fiber. The state of that digestion placed the meal at roughly 2 to 4 hours before her death. It matches precisely the timeline of a woman who ate something at an airport or on a plane, came home just before 2 in the morning, and went to bed. Shanann Watts was a healthy, sober, pregnant woman who had just come home. Every organ in her body confirmed it. Every toxicological finding confirmed it. And the only abnormality in the entire internal examination, the only finding that deviated from the picture of a physically healthy 34-year-old woman, was the damage that had been done to her from the outside. The fourth phase of the examination focused entirely on the fetus, and it is the section of the report that carries the heaviest human weight. The male fetus, formally recorded as being approximately 15 weeks in gestational age, was examined after the post-mortem extrusion that occurred following Shanann's burial. His crown-to-rump length was measured at 10.5 centimeters. His weight was recorded at 38 grams. Despite the traumatic nature of the circumstances of his recovery, he was found to be structurally intact. His internal organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver, were in the early and appropriate stages of fetal development and showed no congenital abnormalities, no defects, no signs of any natural pathology that would have compromised his development. The placental tissue was also examined and showed no signs of premature detachment or disease that would have affected the pregnancy prior to Shanann's death. The toxicology results for the fetus mirrored those of his mother. No medications, no poisons, no drugs. Any ethanol present was attributed entirely to post-mortem decomposition, not to anything either of them had consumed. The medical conclusion of the fetal examination is precise and without ambiguity. He was a healthy, developing male who died as a direct physiological consequence of his mother's death. There was no independent trauma to the fetus, no separate cause of death, no mechanism of harm that was directed at him independently. The cessation of his life was the immediate and inevitable result of the mechanical asphyxiation that stopped his mother's heart and cut off the supply of oxygenated blood that sustained him. He died because she died. And he died because of what was done to her neck by the hands of the person sleeping next to her. His name was Nico Lee Watts. He was 15 weeks old. He weighed 38 grams. He had been announced publicly with the kind of joy that is completely unguarded and completely real. He had been named. He had been discussed in the specific and tender language reserved for a child who is already loved before he has a face. He had been talked about in the context of a future that his mother was actively building toward. The medical examiner's report is the only official document that ever formally recorded his existence, and it recorded it as a cause of death. The fifth phase of the examination turned to the skin, the bruising patterns, and the hair, and this phase is where the evidence of what happened to Shanann's neck became visually documented rather than merely internally confirmed. Decomposition can mask or mimic the appearance of trauma on the skin surface, and so the examiner performed subcutaneous incisions, cuts beneath the outer layer of skin, to look for deep tissue hemorrhaging that would differentiate between the discoloration of decay and the bruising of an assault. What those incisions revealed was that the dark marks present on Shanann's neck were not byproducts of decomposition. They were the result of targeted external pressure applied with significant force. The bruising was deep. It was localized to the anterior and lateral surfaces of the neck, the front and sides, suggesting a broad application of pressure consistent with human hands rather than a narrow implement. Across the face and neck, the examiner documented cyanosis, a purple to blue to green discoloration that occurs when the blood in the tissue is deprived of oxygen in the period immediately before the heart stops. It is the color of a body that fought, physiologically if not physically, to remain alive. Critically, the examination of the neck found no ligature marks. In strangulation cases involving a cord, rope, belt, or any linear implement, the skin typically retains a distinct furrow or groove where that implement made contact. There was no such mark, on Shanann's neck. The absence of a ligature mark is as definitive as any positive finding in this section of the report. It tells the examiner, without ambiguity, that the pressure was applied not by an object, but by a person's hands. The examination of the scalp and hair added the final layer to this phase. No lacerations, no contusions, no subgaleal hemorrhage, no signs that she was struck in the head or slammed against any surface prior to or during the strangulation. The crime was not chaotic. It was not a fight that escalated. It was singular and concentrated, all of its force directed at one location, maintained until the body below it stopped. The sixth phase entered the cranial cavity. When the medical examiner removed the calvarium, the outer dome of the skull, there were no fractures, no external trauma, no hemorrhaging beneath the scalp. Shanann was not struck in the head. What the brain itself revealed, however, was the internal reality of a body that had been deprived of oxygen. The brain was congested and edematous, weighing approximately 1,450 grams, heavier than it should be, swollen with fluid that had accumulated as the result of hypoxia. The gyri, the ridges on the surface of the cerebral cortex, were flattened. The sulci, the grooves between them, were narrowed. These are the classic pathological findings of manual strangulation, as seen inside the skull, and they are the result of a specific and well-documented mechanism. When pressure is applied to the neck, it does not simply block the airway. It simultaneously compresses the jugular veins, which are the vessels responsible for draining blood away from the brain. When those veins are compressed, blood continues briefly to be pushed into the skull by the carotid arteries, which require greater pressure to occlude, while the drainage pathway is already closed. This creates an immediate and massive increase in intracranial pressure. The brain swells. The tissue compresses against the interior of the skull. And in the absence of oxygenated blood, the cells begin to die. The brain of Shanann Watts recorded all of this. It was the brain of a healthy woman with no tumors, no pre-existing hemorrhages, no signs of natural stroke or aneurysm. Its only abnormality was the direct and documented consequence of what was done to her neck. The sixth phase of the examination closes the clinical circuit between the external marks on the skin and the internal failure of the central nervous system. It provides a precise medical map of the final minutes of a life ending by deprivation of air. The formal summary of the examination synthesized every finding from every phase into a single certified medical conclusion. The cardiovascular system was healthy. The respiratory system was healthy. The central nervous system was healthy. There was no natural disease. There was no pre-existing condition. There was no alternative explanation available in the biological record. The internal trauma was localized and specific to the neck, and the trajectory from external pressure to internal hemorrhaging to pulmonary edema to cerebral swelling traced a clear, unbroken clinical narrative from cause to death. The report concluded with the formal certification of the cause of death, asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. By specifying manual, the examiner stated explicitly that the pressure was applied by human hands rather than by any implement or ligature. This finding was supported by the deep tissue hemorrhaging in the neck musculature, the localized bruising on the anterior and lateral neck, and the specific and confirmed absence of any furrow or groove associated with hanging or ligature strangulation. The manner of death was officially classified as homicide. In medical legal terms, that classification is a factual statement denoting that the death was caused by the intentional act of another person. The summary also incorporated the fetal findings, noting that the death of the 15-week-old fetus was a direct fetal demise, resulting from the mother's asphyxiation. There was no independent cause of death for the fetus. The loss of the mother's oxygenated blood was the sole mechanism of his death. The anatomical summary stands as a permanent scientific record, stripped of speculation, stripped of social media narratives, reduced to the undeniable facts of biology and physics. And what those facts state is this: a sudden, overwhelming application of force was applied to the neck of a sleeping woman. It was maintained without interruption until her heart stopped, and it was applied by human hands. Now let us return to the morning that record describes, because the science tells us what happened inside that house. The investigation tells us what happened after. On the morning of August 13th, while Shanann's daughters Bella and Celeste slept in their rooms down the hall, Chris Watts killed his wife in their bedroom. He then placed the bodies of his daughters and his wife into his work truck and drove approximately 40 miles to the Survey 319 oil and gas well site where he was employed by Anadarko Petroleum. At that site, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave in the earth near the facility. Bella, who was 4 years old, and Celeste, who was 3 years old, were placed inside oil storage tanks on the property. The hatches on those tanks were small enough for a child's body, not large enough for an adult. The physical reality of what those dimensions mean requires no elaboration. In his 2019 prison interviews with investigators from the Weld County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, conducted at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he had been transferred after sentencing, Chris Watts provided what became the most detailed and most disturbing account of the morning of August 13th. Those interviews, which were later released publicly, revealed details that fundamentally altered the understanding of the timeline and the nature of the crime beyond what his initial statements had contained. What he described in that room, in those interviews, is part of the documented public record of this case, and it is the kind of thing that stays with investigators, journalists, and anyone who reads it carefully. But before those confessions, before the arrest, before the bodies were found, there was an afternoon on August 13th that has its own record. Nicole Atkinson, the friend who had dropped Shanann off the night before, became concerned when Shanann missed a scheduled prenatal appointment that morning. Shanann had been looking forward to that appointment. She was not the kind of person who missed a prenatal visit without explanation, and she was not answering her phone. Nicole drove to the house. She knocked. She received no answer. She called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived and were met at the door by Chris Watts. He was present at the home. He allowed them inside. The house appeared normal. The children's rooms showed beds that had been slept in. Shanann's purse and keys were inside. Her phone was inside. She was not. Chris told officers he had not seen Shanann since she left to visit a friend after they had an argument. He was calm. He was cooperative. And in the afternoon of that same day, he agreed to a live television interview with a Denver local news station conducted on his front lawn, in which he stated that he hoped his family was safe and described his relationship with Shanann using the past tense. He told the reporter that he had wanted a separation and had spoken to Shanann about it that morning. That interview, broadcast widely and reviewed extensively, became one of the central behavioral exhibits analyzed by investigators in the days that followed. By August 15, 2018, investigators had traced the GPS data from Chris Watts's work truck, which placed him at the Survey 319 oil and gas well site on the morning of August 13th. Officers went to that site. They found Shanann. They found Bella and Celeste. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15th and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, and 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. He initially entered a plea of not guilty. On November 6, 2018, he changed that plea. He entered a guilty plea to all charges in exchange for the removal of the death penalty as a sentencing option. On November 19, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for the remaining charges. He was transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Juneau, Wisconsin, where he remains. The prosecution did not require the autopsy to establish guilt. Chris Watts pleaded guilty, but the autopsy served a different function, one that is just as important. It ensured that the cause of death could not be disputed, reframed, or altered by any subsequent narrative that Chris Watts chose to offer. And he did offer alternative narratives. In his 2019 prison interviews, he attempted at one point to suggest that Shanann had harmed the girls before he killed her. That claim was rejected by investigators, by the forensic evidence, and by everyone who examined the record of that morning with any seriousness. The autopsy of Shanann Watts did not leave room for alternative explanations. It documented what her body recorded, and her body recorded the application of external force to her neck by human hands, sustained until her heart stopped, while she was asleep, while she carried a son named Nico, while her daughters slept down the hall, while she had no defensive wounds on her body because she was never given the chance to put any there. The clinical language of forensic pathology is built for precision, not for emotion. It is built to withstand scrutiny, challenge, and time. And sometimes that precision makes it harder to hold the full human weight of what it is describing. But if you read the absence of defensive wounds the way investigators read it, as a record of what could not happen because it was never permitted to begin, then the clinical language becomes the most honest language available. It does not speculate. It does not editorialize. It states. And what it states about Shanann Watts is this. She was 34 years old. She had spent years of her life fighting an autoimmune disease that attacked her own body and had refused to stop living. She had carried 3 pregnancies to term under conditions that made each of them medically significant. She had built a business from her own story of illness and recovery. She had raised 2 daughters who, by every account from friends, family, and the videos she posted publicly, were loved with the specific and total love of a mother who was fully present. She had named her son before he had a face. She had come home from a work trip after midnight. She had eaten recently. She was sober. She had no drugs in her system. She had no weapons in her hands. She had no defensive wounds on her body because she was asleep. Because she was home. Because she trusted the person lying next to her. Because she had absolutely no reason not to. The medical examiner's report is the only official document that recorded Nico Watts's existence as a human being rather than as a legal charge. It recorded his crown to rump length. It recorded his weight. It recorded the absence of any defect in his developing organs. It recorded that he was healthy and that he died for no reason other than the cessation of his mother's heart. The record of Shanann Watts and of Nico Watts and of Bella Watts and of Celeste Watts does not disappear because a court case concluded. It continues to exist. It continues to ask to be read accurately, completely, and with the full human weight of what it contains. The autopsy report of Shanann Watts, case number 1835, is a document of forensic science, but it is also the final testimony of a woman who was given no other opportunity to speak. And in reading it carefully, in refusing to reduce her to a headline or a statistic or a case file, we give her the only thing left to give. The truth of what happened, stated clearly, in full, without flinching, and without looking away. This is what Crimes Records exists to do. If this video gave you something, if it made you feel the weight of this case the way it deserves to be felt, please like this video, share it with someone who should hear this story, and subscribe to Crimes Records so you never miss a case told this way. Every victim on this channel is handled with the same accuracy, the same care, and the same refusal to let the science be separated from the humanity underneath it. Ring the notification bell. We will see you in the next one. For Shanann. For Bella. For Celeste. For Nico. The record holds.